Hello, welcome to another Writerly Witterings with me with a rather boring cup of tea, but it is early in the day as you can see. Cheers. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the 100 Years' War because it was a fascinating period and a lot of people wondered what I was going to do after writing all my books on the Knights Templar, which I will probably come back to before too long. But many years ago, when I was still a teenager, so going back to the 1970s, I read this book, The 100 Years' War by Desmond Seward. In fact, I read it as a delightful hardback, which I got quite cheaply, but I loved that book so much I kept lending it to people, and someone, the last thieving devil, hasn't given it back. I don't know who it was, but I lost it about 15 years ago. But that's a really good brief summary of the 100 Years' War. Very interesting. However, after that I got interested in the 100 Years' War, and so I started reading other books. This Jonathan Sumption, Trial by Fire, this is the second book of his. The first one's up there actually, which is called Trial by Battle, yes, which finishes with the Battle of Crécy and the Siege of Calais. This more or less starts with Poitiers. And Jonathan Sumption is an expert at going through all the documentation and finding out all the details about battles and so on. So Seward or Sumption, I can thoroughly recommend either of those two for information on the 100 Years' War. But what really got me about it was that it was such a confusing time, but it set off so many problems for the future. It set off the idea that Britain and France should always be at loggerheads. It set off some changes in styles of law and changes in the style of gathering armies, for example. It had a huge impact on the way that peasants were treated in the UK. They were treated more as individuals because basically the noblemen couldn't control them. They were pretty vicious, ferocious fighting chaps. It set off the feeling that mercenaries were evil, nasty people across the whole of Europe, because after the 100 Years' War, in the middle of the 100 Years' War, after each battle, there were whole numbers of English soldiers, Gascon soldiers, German soldiers, Flemish soldiers, French soldiers, who basically had no form of income, didn't have a home to go to, and so they spent the rest of their lives as what would have been called outlaw gangs in the past. But when you've got an outlaw gang with 5,000 men in it, you suddenly call it a mercenary army. It's a bit easier. And these were evil. You've got people like Sir John Hawkwood, who was never knighted by a knight, I don't think, son of a cobbler in Essex, who ended up commanding one of the biggest companies of freebooters and routiers that ever existed across the whole of Europe. In fact, he was noted in that time because rather than just taking the job which offered the most money, so turning coat in the middle of a battle and going and fighting for your enemies because they were offering you some more money, John Hawkwood was known to be quite honest and decent in his dealings, so if you paid him money he would stay on your side for good. In fact, he was so highly respected that he married the daughter of one of the most powerful people in Florence, and in the end he was buried in Florence Cathedral in the Duomo. You can still see the painting that was made of him in there now. But these guys were not pleasant, nice people. They were horrible. The idea in the 100 Years' War was Dampnum, and Dampnum was the idea of total war, so you absolutely devastated the countryside. They reckon that on the Black Prince's march through France leading up to Poitiers, he devastated an area 50 miles wide, because he had his army stretched out in a long line, and they burned and murdered everything that was in their path all the way up. And the idea was to prove to the people that their king and the noblemen couldn't protect them, so there was no point in their remaining loyal to the king. They might just as well come over to the English king, who was therefore clearly that much more powerful because he could impose all this suffering on them. Not the best way of persuading people to come to your side, I don't think, but still it functioned for 100 years or so. Britain started out as a tiny little island. It had some bits of Gascony in France and so on, but it ended up at the high point of the Hundred Years' War, high point for the English, controlling about 2/3 of the whole of France, which is a surprising, somewhat shocking thing to consider. The French then, however, under Du Guesclin and the Constable of France, got much more sensible and started fighting more logically, and gradually pushed us out of the whole lot, apart from Calais, which we held on to for another 100 and 200 years until Elizabeth's time. But the main thing about the Hundred Years' War really was that a small professional English army kept being faced down by much, much larger French armies, but still survived. There was a core of professionalism in the way that they fighted. I got so excited by the whole concept that I always wanted to write about it, and I eventually hit on the idea of copying George MacDonald Fraser's book Quartered Safe Out Here, great inspiring book in its own right, and wrote a story from the point of view of a platoon, a vingtaine of archers in that war. That became Fields of Glory. The second book, which is coming out shortly, Blood on the Sand, which I'll talk a little bit more about in my next video, is the follow-up to that. And then I am now currently writing the last book in the trilogy, which is all about Poitiers, 10 years later on. I enjoyed them. Hopefully you will too. If you have any comments, please put them down in the box at the bottom there. Don't forget to like and subscribe and tell your friends about the videos if you enjoy them, because I'm enjoying making them, so I want to have justification for carrying on. And hopefully I will see you next time.